TikTok time to rock. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's watching from all over the world. It's your friendly neighborhood philosopher here, D. Wood. I already know before I look over there, you guys are going to be whining. A bunch of whiners. Late. But I'm here, in spite of all your whining, with your friendly neighborhood historical Jesus scholar, Mike Licona. How you doing, Mike?
Hey, David. Great to see you again, brother.
Yep. And for anyone who doesn't know the background here, I've known Mike longer than pretty much everyone I still know, except for a couple family members and a couple of guys I still know from prison. But met Mike the year I got out of prison. Met Nabil a little after I met Mike. Met my wife after I met Mike and Nabil. So, yep, I've known Mike and his wife, Debbie, for a long time.
Yeah, you and Marie are like family to us, brother.
Be careful, because it's not exactly safe being in my family, man. Not exactly safe. A little dysfunctional here and there, a little dysfunctional. Yeah, but hey, before we jump into things, why don't you give everyone a little bit about your background, and then we're gonna check out a debate, because your mind is gonna be blown, Mike. Your mind is gonna be blown by powerful Dawa response to Jesus' crucifixion.
Well, I grew up in a Christian family, became a Christian around the age of 10, went to college as a music major, played saxophone. Just developed a real love for God during that time and wanted to learn how to read the New Testament in its original language, Greek. So I took some Greek in undergrad and then applied for grad school and ended up doing a master's degree in New Testament studies. Took as much Greek as I could. Was studying scriptures for several hours a day, studying or praying 1 to 2 hours a day, and really felt close to the Lord. But then one day I just started to question my faith. What if I'd been born in Pakistan? Would I be a Muslim? If I'd been born in India, would I be a Hindu, etc.? Is it really the reason I'm a Christian is because that's all I've been exposed to? Now, of course, you could become a Christian or learn about it for all the wrong reasons, or maybe it's the only thing that you are familiar with, but it just turns out to be correct. That could be the case. But I wondered, do people in other religious beliefs, traditions, who are just as convinced about their view as I am about Christianity, could I be self-deceived? And if I was, it could cost me eternity. And so I began to question my faith, and I've questioned it several times since. Gary Habermas, a philosophy professor, helped me through my initial doubts, spent a lot of time with me, talking with me through it, referring me to various journal articles and books that I read. I listened to debates, really just consumed debates. I mean, we did that when I first met you. And so anyway, I got involved, ended up doing a PhD in New Testament studies. I wanted to study the resurrection of Jesus from a historian's perspective. So I had to learn how historians carry along their works. I studied, more than 100 journal articles written by professional historians and philosophers of history on how to do history, and read many books on how to do it. And then I ended up publishing on it and writing on historical method, and this comparing how historians of Jesus work and combining their work together, and did my own work on the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and on other aspects of historical Jesus research. Became a professor at Houston Christian University back in 2012, and have been involved in, I think it's 38 debates at this point, 8 of which have been with Bart Ehrman, and we've since become friends. 8 debates
with Bart Ehrman?
Yeah.
And then, as Mike mentioned, he writes kind of big nerdy books like this. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. Muslims, way bigger than the Quran. Way bigger than the Quran. This book is like, oh, look at your your cute little book. Oh, cute little book there, right? So just so you know what you're dealing with there. And they've got one verse in the Quran that sounds, and they can't even agree on that, sounds like it's denying Jesus' death by crucifixion. And that settles the matter. That settles the matter for all of them. But yeah, you were mentioning debates. And that was so two interesting things there for you Nabil fans. We used to meet over at your house, Mike, bunch of young people who are interested in apologetics, but we'd also have atheists and even Muslims come sometimes if they wanted to lay out a case. And it was there. Nabil gave his awesome presentation on the scientific miracles of the Quran.
I remember that. I remember that. He put up that the board with the erasable ink and gave it, and he did the best he could, but it wasn't good enough.
Yeah, and I still have the emails from afterwards where it was you, me, and Nabil. Me, and Nabil were emailing back and forth because he made all these claims, and I start messaging him going, where is that? I want to read it for myself. I want to read that for myself. And then I'd start responding and quoting what the sources were actually saying and so on. So anyway, those were pretty cool times. Those were pretty cool times over at Mike's house. And then, one more. So there's actually three super interesting things, but it was over at your house where Nabil brought his dad to have a sort of discussion / debate with you and Gary Habermas on Jesus' death and resurrection. And that was an awesome time. That was an awesome time. And before
that was fun.
Yeah, it was before that. I was so the background, some people know this because I mentioned it before, but me and Nabil had been arguing back and forth for a while, and one day I asked him, I said, okay, look, what would be a serious issue for you? What would be a serious issue that we could investigate? That what would it take for you to what would really bother you if we started looking into it and you saw something? What would it be? What might bother you and make you start wondering if your religion is actually true? And he thought for a while and he said, if I saw my dad kind of backed into a corner, he said, just the way I was raised, I have a lot of respect for my dad. A lot of what I believe about Islam was from my dad studying and passing it on to me. And he said, so I really respect my dad's knowledge. And so if I saw my dad backed into a corner on something, that might make me think I need to rethink things and go investigate for myself. Because he said, I'm just going to be honest. And it was cool. He's honest like this. He said, just a lot of confidence in my religion is based on my dad. And it was a little after that I said, hey, Nabil, some Christians meeting over at my friend Mike's house, and why don't you guys come on over and we could have a discussion about Jesus' death and resurrection. And so he came over, and it was Nabil and his dad and Mike and Gary Habermas. And so that was a fun time. And the other thing was me and Nabil, back when he was still a Muslim, we went and watched your debate with Shabir Ali. And that day I met Shabir Ali because I messaged him before time. This was right after The Passion of the Christ came out.
You took him to that movie, didn't you, that afternoon?
Yeah, I messaged him. I just looked up his email on his website, and I said, hey, The Passion of the Christ just came out, so I don't know if it's going to come up like in the Q&A of the debate or something like that, but you might want to see it. And he messaged me back and thanked me for letting him know. And he said, I don't think I'll have time because I'm traveling and then I'm going to be there. And I said, I'll pick you up and take you there. And he said, oh, that'd be great. And so, yep, I took Shabir Ali to see The Passion of the Christ. And then me and Nabil watched the debate. And then we had the debate. And then Gary was there. And then we were all chatting afterwards. And then me and Nabil went and we sat in his car for hours discussing things. And I remember that night particularly.
Yeah, but I remember you were walking with Gary and Gary's grad assistant, I think, right? After the debate, because Gary and his grad assistant had come up for it, driven up from Liberty, and you guys were walking, I don't know, probably 20 yards ahead of Nabil and me, and I remember walking down the steps from that one beautiful auditorium, and walking outside, and Nabil said, "Well, you definitely won that debate," and I said, "Well, thanks." And I said, "How does that make you feel? Since this is just my second debate, and Shabir is like one of the best in the world in this." And he said, "Well, I have to admit, you have some evidence. You have some good evidence for the resurrection and for the truth of Christianity, but Islam." We've got evidence too. The only thing that I think you guys have over Islam is the resurrection of Jesus.
Just that.
Just the resurrection. So I said, Nabil, did you hear what you just said? Because if Jesus rose, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. And he said, yeah, I guess you're right. Gary, David, Nabil, tell him what you just said.
Yeah, he would say things like that periodically. One time I was saying, okay, Nabil, there are all sorts of religions making all kinds of claims. Christianity here, we have something that you can investigate and know that it's true based on this and based on just historical examination. And I said, what do you have like that in Islam? He goes, well, Christianity seems to be kind of unique in that. Wait, what? But yeah, so we were hanging out in the car, me and Nabil, for hours, and he. His main objection there when we were chatting afterwards was the idea that Jesus could pay for the sins of others. And we're just going back and forth. And he's saying it's unjust. He said, look, it's like you got a murderer over there. And I say, oh, I'll punish this baby for what the murderer did. Then the murderer's free. And I killed the baby. And so we're going back and forth. And I was trying to explain it. And all of a sudden I started talking about Philemon, the book of Philemon. I go, okay, you're saying it's unjust for one person to pay for what another has done. I said, let me tell you about this one chapter, book of the Bible. There's a guy named Philemon, and he had a slave named Onesimus, and Onesimus runs away, and he would have been in pretty big trouble. Anyway, he meets Paul, he converts to Christianity, and Paul tells him, you're not going to be on the run for the rest of your life. You're actually we're gonna deal with this. We're gonna get this handled. And he sends him back. He sends the runaway slave back to his master Philemon, but he sends him with a letter. And in that letter, he tells Philemon whatever he apparently Onesimus had stolen some stuff to pay for his escape and runaway journey and stuff like that, because Paul says, whatever he owes you, I will pay that when I come to you, and I want you to receive him as you would receive me. This is Paul, leader and a Roman citizen. He said, I want you to receive him as you would receive me. So this is a guy who would have been in all kinds of trouble. Paul agrees to pay for what he has done. And then he says, I want you to receive him as you would receive me. Don't receive him as a runaway slave. I'm paying his debt. I want you to receive him as you would receive me. And I said, are you telling me that's somehow evil and immoral? Voluntarily paying for someone else. And he paused for a little while and he goes, well, I guess if you put it that way. It's just a funny situation. It's like Paul was clearly getting that from the gospel. Like the gospel had impacted him, and he's like, oh, I want to pay for someone else so that someone else can be restored, have a restored relationship and so on. So anyway, cool.
That's pretty cool. Times. I didn't know about that conversation. That's pretty cool.
Yep. Those were cool times, my friend. Cool times.
They were.
And let's take these couple of super chats real quick, and then we'll jump into this debate where your mind will be blown by how powerful Dawah has become. See, you debated Shabir back in the day. You ain't seen nothing yet. You ain't seen nothing yet till you've seen the new generation of powerful Dawah. Official here said, as a Jew, I respect all world religions. All world religions teach peace and harmony. Do they, though? I can think of one that doesn't. Anyway, I just want to put that up. Put that up there for that. We got JP here. Hey, JP. I'll be talking to JP tomorrow night, ladies and gentlemen. He says, David is late. How can I ever live? I know. It's pretty rare. Pretty sure Dee's response started the okay, perfect tick. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, Korra, who's in this debate, people can say something that she completely disagrees with or destroys Islam. She'll go, okay, perfect. And it's like, wait, what? Why are you saying it? You have corrupted my brain. My girlfriend recently bought an appliance that turns zucchini into noodles. She calls it the Zudler, and every time it reminds me of the Al-Zut. Thanks for ruining my vocabulary. God bless. Yeah, I don't know if you know about the Zoot, Mike, but better if you don't.
Yes.
Oh, cool. What's longer, Momo's? What is this? What's longer, Momo's Wang or Malik's rap career? Mike, you would know about this. We had on a woman who went through the sources, and she argued that the best explanation for a bunch of weird details that we have in the sources is that Muhammad had a micro pee, but she has like all this evidence. It's weird times, but that's just what happens when they make their sources available to us. Let's start a conspiracy that Korra had an earpiece. Yeah, we can. And TikTok time to get the Glock. Oh, hi, Mike. That's got to be one of your buddies. That's got to be someone who
Love
knows
it.
you.
Yes.
And we've got, even though it's fiction, Saitama's smile illustrates demonic mind manipulation. Demons can manipulate emotions. Wanted to beat Nordine to it this stream. Don't forget Juge and Majuge too. There's a person named Nordine who is interested in the demonic realm and always brings up interesting things. D Wood, you mentioned IP's interview in D Wood. You mentioned on IP's interview in PragerU. Oh, I think you. I was mentioned on IP's interview with PragerU. That's weird. Why would he mention me? But smart. All right, everyone ready? Ready, Mike? All right, everyone. Here, this was prompt 4. Now, here's the thing, everyone. The first three, there were 5 total prompts, and then there was a one-on-one. So we went through the first 3. I thought Korra got crushed on all 3. This is the one where everyone says she did best, and Muslims are loving this one, and now they're saying there's no good historical evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion. So let's check it out.
The crucifixion of Jesus is not a well-established historical event.
I don't want to keep stopping every 5 seconds, but just based on that prompt, Mike.
Well, Garrett Ludeman was, I think it's very well attested. Garrett Ludeman was an atheist New Testament scholar, and he said it's indisputable that he died by crucifixion. You've got John Dominic Crossan, who is essentially an atheist. He doesn't believe that there's any kind of supreme being in the universe, and he says that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Most historians would say it's beyond doubt that he was crucified and died as a result. So, there's really good evidence for it. But to say that it's not a well-established fact, that's really naive. And you're going to have to come up with some. I can bring the goods for the evidence, but she's going to have to be able to refute that.
Muslims love to go to Bart Ehrman, even though if they were to listen more closely to him, it definitely wouldn't work. And I had Bart Ehrman on with me for an interview once, and yeah, he saw some pretty big problems with the Muslim view of things. But what does he?
No,
think?
he certainly
He
believes
thinks
Jesus
it's a
died by crucifixion.
Yeah, but not really a solid case, right?
That's very solid.
All right.
Very solid. Yeah. I don't know how, if you want to jump into it right now, but yeah, it's really solid. It's one of the best things known about Jesus. You got all kinds of evidence for his death by crucifixion.
We'll see. Maybe we'll unpack some things as we go through this debate. But what I'm hearing is that Korra, who's 21 years old and Muslima, she says it's not well established historically, but you're saying actual, even non-Christian scholars in historical Jesus studies and New Testament studies, they think it's a slam dunk.
Slam dunk would be a good way to put it. Yep. It is that solid.
But
You might have, I think, one skeptical New Testament scholar over the last, since maybe 1985, who thinks Jesus may have survived his crucifixion. That's the only thing, only one I can think of. Only one. And there were 2 physicians who published in some Royal Journal article, I forgot the name of it, and they suggested that Jesus may have survived crucifixion. And in the very next issue, you had a bunch of other physicians just jumping all over them and criticizing their arguments. But I mean, they're not scholars in that sense. They're just looking at the medical implications. They're not looking at the documentary evidence. So, yeah, the evidence, especially, let's put it this way, crucifixion was a real brutal way of being executed. And even if you had survived, at least by natural causes, this wouldn't necessarily apply to Islam, since Muslims think, and the Quran says that God rescued Jesus. So if God can resurrect Jesus, God could rescue Jesus if he wanted to. It's just a matter of what he did. But the swoon theory, as it used to be called, and now nobody refers to that anymore, it's the apparent death theory, because no one uses the term swoon. I mean, what does that mean, right? So the apparent death hypothesis that Jesus somehow survived, even if he did, what would he look like? Would he convince anyone that he had been resurrected in an immortal body? Not a chance, not just a few days afterward. But understanding what crucifixion would happen, the tortures that preceded crucifixion itself, and how a person died, how they knew they were dead, it's unmistakable. They're not going to take him off the cross alive. Now, again, Allah could have done that. He could have rescued Jesus in that sense. But the question is that what happened? And we have no reason to think that is what happened. We have every reason to think that Jesus died by crucifixion.
And I'm sure we'll be bringing this up as we go through this debate, but it is weird that Islam is kind of so desperate to undermine Christianity that they'll make God this cosmic trickster who tricked literally billions of people into believing something that's false, and who started what they regard as the world's biggest false religion, and corrupted.
That's right. Yeah.
Corrupted his own prophet's gospel, because we open the gospel now, it says over and over again, Jesus died. And Muslims say, that's been corrupted. Okay, who corrupted that? Where'd they get that idea? Oh, from your God? So your God corrupted the gospel. Okay, don't blame the Apostle Paul or the Council of Nicaea or anything else. It's your God, guys. Your God did that. So,
well, one thing that's indisputable among scholars today is that Jesus' disciples claimed that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Nobody really disputes that they claimed it. I'm not aware of anyone who disputes that they actually believed it. Okay. Nobody, no bona fide scholar thinks that they were lying about it. Okay. Is what I'm saying. So they actually believed it. Now, you could say they were hallucinating or whatever, but they really, truly believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. We've got evidence for that. You've got Paul himself. You've got oral tradition, the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, plus the sermon summaries in the book of Acts that most scholars do think are summaries of the apostolic preaching. And then you've got the four Gospels, and you've got Clement of Rome and Polycarp. You got 9 sources, early sources right there, that have the apostles claiming that Jesus rose and appeared to them. And then you got 5 sources from the first century alone that talk about how these disciples they engaged in spreading the message and teachings of Jesus. All were persecuted. All were willing to suffer and to die as martyrs. We have reports that at least 3 of them, really good evidence that 3 of them, probably 4 of them at least, died. And that's just from the first century that they died as martyrs. You got stuff later on, which may or may not be true, but 5 sources from the first century that talk about this, which suggests, because they're willing to suffer and die for it, it suggests that they sincerely believed what they were proclaiming is true. Liars make poor martyrs, right? So the point is, if they truly believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them, where'd they get that idea? Where did they get that? And why didn't Allah tell them the truth and change their mind. And as you say, David, as a result, the disciples went out and spread the gospel around the world, and it became the largest religion in the world and the greatest enemy of Islam. It doesn't seem that would be a very wise move from the so-called all-wise God.
Yeah, sounds really, really stupid. And it's interesting because lots of Muslims have a problem, just what you were talking about there, because there's one issue with Jesus' death by crucifixion and Muslims believing that Allah is this cosmic trickster who tricked people into believing the crucifixion. But
well, we can understand why he would trick the Romans. We can understand why they trick the Jewish authorities. But why would he trick Jesus' disciples, whom, as you pointed out to me once, because you're a student in the Quran in Islam, I'm not. You pointed out to me once, and I checked it out, it's true. The Quran refers to Jesus' disciples as Muslims.
Yep.
So God would not only have deceived the Romans and the Jewish authorities, but he would have deceived the followers of the prophet Jesus, whom are called Muslims. And if he's going to deceive them, how can any Muslim today know that he's not deceiving them? Yep. I thought that was a real valid point that you had made in the past. Never forgot it.
And apparently even some of Muhammad's own companions got the implications of believing in an omnipotent deceiver, because that happened in the Quran as well. It's in Surah 8 that Allah gave Muhammad a dream. So the Meccan caravan is going to go past Medina, and Muhammad wants to rob the Meccan caravan. And Allah gives Muhammad a dream that it's only protected by a few people. It's only protected by a few people. So Muhammad announces his dream to his followers. Hey, Allah revealed to me that there's only going to be a few people guarding it. And so the Muslims, yay, we can take them. And they march out, and the Muslims were outnumbered 3-1. The Muslims were outnumbered 3-1. And so they're complaining later on. And then Allah reveals in Surah 8, hey, I knew you'd be scared if I told you the truth. So I deceived you. I deceived you into believing it was only a few people. And so, but I mean, think about this. Allah deceived the Muslim community who followed Muhammad, and he used Muhammad to deceive them, to trick them into doing what he wanted. If you combine that with Allah deceiving Jesus' followers and getting them to endure torture and death for a lie, where there was no reason. Like, what's he trying to get them to do? Preach the gospel for the rest of their lives until they die or get killed? Like, what's the good goal there? But this apparently worked its way down to Muhammad's companions, because Muhammad's closest companion and the first of the rightly guided caliphs once said, he said, if I had 1 foot in paradise, I would still fear Allah's deception. If I had 1 foot in other words, he dies, he sees paradise, he sees all his virgins lined up, he starts stepping in, and he's still worried that Allah's going to be like, psych, and then throw him into hell. You don't trust that sort of God, and that's again Muhammad's closest. Why that's should be especially concerning to Muslims. Most Muslims have no assurance of salvation. Muhammad said, I don't know what Allah is going to do with me, but there were a handful of people that Muhammad guaranteed would be in paradise. Abu Bakr was one of them, and he still feared. Why? Because Allah had done it before, tricked him through his own prophet that he believed in. So how do I know he's not tricking me all the time? And just pretty wild stuff. But that's kind of introduction, guys, for all of this. Let's see where it goes.
My name is Korra.
Hi, Korra. I'm Johanna.
Hi, Korra. I'm Raisha.
I'm Jessica.
Hi, I'm Delaney.
Hi, nice to meet you guys. All right, so my position on the crucifixion of Jesus is that rather than him being crucified at the hands of both the Jews and the Romans, he was saved and raised to the second heaven by God. God did not allow a soul to harm him in that instance in terms of death and so on, right? And I obviously believe that although you guys believe that Jesus was crucified and that theology is echoed within Christianity and so on and so forth, I do not believe that this is an undisputed fact, not just extra-biblically, but even within the Bible, due to a multitude of different inconsistencies and so on and so forth. So what are you guys' thoughts on that?
I think that's interesting because the crucifixion of Jesus is the most well-known historically attested event, not only by biblical sources, but also extra biblical sources. So I know that your Quran mentions that it only made for him to appear that way, but it just confuses me. We have all these historical evidence and the historians written about this, but 600 years later, you have Allah saying that it only appeared that way. So how does that make sense?
Okay, beautiful. So the Quran isn't actually the only instance in which somebody disputes the crucifixion taking place. We have historians also acknowledging, the same exact historians that you will appeal to say that the crucifixion happened, also say that there were early groups disputing the crucifixion. Right? For example, we have groups such as the Basilidians who deny.
Oh boy. Everyone, notice what she just did there. She said, the same historians who will tell you that Jesus died by crucifixion and that it's indisputable and so on, they'll tell you that there were early groups of Christians that had a different view. Think she's leaving some things out here. So Mike, if the same historians, Bart Ehrman, for instance, any of these guys would acknowledge what she just said, but not with the implications, and they would say she's seriously leaving some things out. They would say, yes, Jesus' death by crucifixion is as sure as anything historical can ever be. It's indisputable, things like that. They would say, yes, there were some early groups, starting in the 2nd century, there were some early groups that didn't believe Jesus died by crucifixion. And so she's making it sound like, oh, they would say it's debatable. Mike, would any of the historians who say, yeah, there were some groups, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century and so on, who had a different view and didn't believe that Jesus died by crucifixion, would any of these guys entertain the views of these other groups as historically accurate or reliable about Jesus?
When it comes to let's say his death, no. Basilides that she mentions, he's 2nd century. 2nd century is when that started, and then it went to sometime in the 4th century, and then faded away. But yeah, they could acknowledge that, hey, there were some people who were denying Jesus' death, that someone was substituted in his place. God substituted someone in his place, like the Gospel of Barnabas later would say. But that doesn't mean there's any credible evidence for that. I mean, today, she says the death of Jesus is not an undisputed fact because some people disputed it. Well, some people dispute that we went to the moon. Some people dispute that the earth is round. They're flat earthers. Some people dispute that the Holocaust never occurred. Some people dispute that Jesus ever existed and say that he didn't, Jesus mythers. But these people are so far out there on the fringe that we rightfully turn up our nose at that. Nobody really respects these people. They are a very, very fringe group. People just don't take them seriously. So, because the evidence that Jesus existed, that we landed on the moon, that the earth is round, that the Holocaust occurred, is so abundant and strong. So, to say that it's not an undisputed fact because there were some people like the Basilidians and some others perhaps who said that thought that Jesus survived crucifixion, I mean, that's amazingly naive way of practicing history. What you want to do is go back and say, what were the original earliest people, the followers of Jesus who were there? What were they saying about it? And they were clearly saying Jesus died by crucifixion.
And so that's one issue. This is much later than the 1st century sources. The other really weird thing is we know why these guys were denying Jesus' death by crucifixion, and it was not a historical reason. It was a theological reason. Let's just don't take my word for it, everyone. This is Bart Ehrman's website. So this is Bart Ehrman's website, and he's got this article on the lost gospel of Basilides and so on. He talks a little bit about whether it's a lost gospel or not. But check this out. This is Bart Ehrman's description. I'm going with Basilides here because Korra brought him up as giving a different view. And Ehrman says, to understand Basilides' account of the crucifixion, it's important to realize or remember that many Gnostics did not believe that Christ, as a divine being, could actually suffer. So there were people who believed that Jesus is just divine. He's not a real human. If he seemed to suffer, he was crucified after all, then it was, in fact, all an appearance. Appearance. That's interesting. That's what the Quran says. Different Gnostics had different ways of explaining how it was an appearance. Some said that Christ did not have a real flesh and blood body, so that when it appeared that his enemies inflicted pain and death on him, they were actually unable to do so. Others said that the Christ was a divine being and that Jesus was a separate human. Catch that, guys? Others said that the Christ was a divine being and that Jesus was a separate human being in whom...
That's in the Apocalypse of Peter.
Yeah, and then was a separate human being in whom the Christ came at his baptism and left at his crucifixion, leaving Jesus, the man, to suffer alone, while the Christ, the divine being, was beyond suffering. And Basilides had yet a different explanation. According to Basilides, since Christ was a divine being, he had all sorts of divine powers, and he used them when it came time for him to be crucified. What he did was pull an identity switch. He transformed Simon of Cyrene, who was carrying his cross, to make him look like him. Sound familiar, Muslims? Transform someone else to make him look like him? Jesus, and he transformed himself, Jesus, into the appearance of Simon of Cyrene. So he made Simon of Cyrene look like him, and he made himself look like Simon of Cyrene, and the Romans got confused and crucified Simon of Cyrene. And so, when they arrived at the place of crucifixion, the Romans crucified the wrong man, and Jesus stood beside the cross laughing, looking like Simon of Cyrene, cracking up laughing, ha ha, got the wrong guy. Presumably, Simon didn't think it was so funny. And he says, this idea of Jesus laughing at his enemies who think they can hurt him is found in some other Gnostic writings that do survive, unlike his lost Gospel of Basilides, if it was a gospel. For example, Jesus laughs 4 times in the Gospel of Judas at the ignorance of his disciples, who are not his enemies. They are just dunderheads. And in the writing from Nag Hammadi, called the Second Treatise of the Great Seth, and the other one called the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, not to be confused with the other Apocalypse of Peter that presents a first-hand account of a guided tour of heaven and hell, Jesus laughs at the scene of his crucifixion, specifically at the ones who think they can harm him when, in fact, all they can do is harm the shell of his body, which is not the real him. One reason all this laughing is interesting is that Jesus is never said to laugh in the New Testament. I'm not sure what to make of that. In any event, the earliest account of him laughing may well have been the Gospel of Basilides, if it really existed, from sometime in the early 2nd century. It is one of many books that we very much wish we still had. So, this is why I find it interesting. Again, the objection of the Gnostics and Docetists was not, oh, the historical evidence shows Jesus didn't die. They believed he was just divine. He wasn't actually human. And if he wasn't actually human, the objection arose from Christians, well, how exactly this guy get crucified then? And so they had to come up with some explanation. And it's just amazing that the explanation they used, someone else was disguised to look like Jesus, ends up in the Quran, where they don't have that theological objection. They're not saying, Muslims aren't saying Jesus was just divine and therefore didn't have a human body. They believe Jesus was just a human prophet. And so if someone like Korra is at all taking Basilides seriously as a historical source, she'd have a problem with Islam. But yeah, the real problem there is somehow this story finds its way into the Quran. And you want the best explanation of that, guys? You had the Emperor Justinian, Roman Emperor Justinian, and in the 6th century, he expelled heretics from the Roman Empire, and a bunch of them went down to Arabia with their weird stories. And then one of those weird stories ended up in the Quran with the completely opposite meaning from when it was written in the second century. And so, guys, Korra Korra's response is, oh, but, these same scholars who consider Jesus' death by crucifixion indisputable, they will grant that there were later Christians who had a different view. Yeah, and they'll say they're ridiculous Gnostic nonsense, not actual historical information. Wow. So bad start for Korra there. But notice, everyone, Korra would know this if she did her research. Why is she bringing up Basilides? To deceive people. It's obvious, right? I mean, if she actually studied it, she knows this is nonsense. She knows the reason was not historical; it was theological, and she's tossing that in there, hoping that no one catches it. And that's Dawa, guys. That's Dawa. All right, we ready to jump back into this powerful presentation?
The crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and they also believe that somebody else was crucified in his place, right? They believe in something called substitution theory. We also have some atheists that believe in something called swoon theory. Swoon theory is essentially Jesus being put on the cross and not passing away, and then when he was taken off and so on and so forth, that reconciles the gospel accounts when people saw him again. So we see a multitude of disputes, not just within...
Mike, she just said, we also have some atheists who believe in swoon theory. How popular is that view among scholars?
It's not. It's rare as hen's teeth to find someone like that. Barbara Teering, I don't even know if she's still alive, but she's about as far left as you can go and just hanging off the fringe of the theological left. She's the only scholar of whom I'm aware holds that Jesus survived crucifixion. They put him in the tomb. They came by and put aloe and other herbs on him, and it healed him. And he and Mary Magdalene ended up getting married and going off to either France or Germany and having children there. But other than her, I'm not aware of any scholar who holds that view. So that's been, I mean, David Strauss refuted that in the early 20th century, when he said, even if Jesus had survived crucifixion, what would he look like when he appeared to his disciples? He'd been pierced through his hands and his feet. He'd been scourged. Even if he could walk, which is hardly even possible, again, what would he look like in his pathetic and mutilated state? He would convince no one that he was the risen Prince of Life. Alive, yes. Risen, no. And besides, the swoon theory would also acknowledge that Jesus was crucified, which I don't know if she takes the Muslim view that, like Basilides did, that someone substituted in there so that they were crucified instead of Jesus. Or do they take a view more like the Ahmadis do, that Jesus was crucified, God only made it appear that he was dead on the cross, and then they removed him and buried him? I don't know which one she takes on there, but neither of those work.
And yeah, it's just weird because you mentioned, you've got people who don't, deny that we went to the moon and all kinds of other things, deny all kinds of things, but to just say there are some atheists who say. Yeah. There are some.
Well, there's some atheists that say Islam is false, right?
Yeah, there's some
atheists that say Muhammad is a false prophet. So should I take that seriously just because atheists say that?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, so Korra, we could ask a question here. Korra, there are some atheists who say Muhammad never existed, that he was a fictional character. Does them saying that mean that there isn't good historical evidence for the existence of Muhammad? Does it mean that? Some people say something because somehow here it casts doubt on whether it's an actual historical event. Some people saying it, even if their explanation, even if what they say makes absolutely no sense. So as Mike just pointed out, and it ties into what he was saying earlier, that we know historically that Jesus' disciples were convinced that he had risen from the dead and appeared to them. Right, that he had risen from the dead and appeared to them, and they went out proclaiming his resurrection from the dead. If he had gone through crucifixion, the scourging, being nailed, bleeding all over the place, and then was somehow, woke up in the tomb later on, he would have been so mangled, wouldn't have been able to walk, hobbling around, covered in wounds, things leaking all out of him and so on, they would not have concluded, wow, he's been resurrected. They would have said, whoa, oh my goodness, he survived. Let's get a doctor. That's what they would have said. They wouldn't have concluded that he had been resurrected in a glorified body. So that's why people don't take that theory seriously. You can find dumb people who or people who haven't investigated this all and who just think, oh, okay, so Jesus was crucified, and then his disciples said he appeared to them. Oh, maybe he just survived crucifixion. That's people who don't understand Roman crucifixion, how it works, and then 2, don't understand what it would have done to a person even if he had survived. And 3, don't understand what Jews believed about resurrection. They would have never concluded that. And so just to toss this out there is, this should make you doubt Jesus' death by crucifixion. Korra, this is made for stupid people. You are specifically making this for people who are stupid. Why? Why wouldn't you make an argument for smart people who actually know anything about history? One of life's great mysteries, Mike. I think it's all downhill from here. Let's see.
Theists, but within historical groups in the 1st and 2nd century, and we see church fathers acknowledging this as well. For example,
wait, did she just say groups in the 1st and 2nd century?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any groups in the 1st century. There might have been toward the end or something, but I'm not aware of any that denied Jesus' death. I don't think they've left any marks.
Yeah, I don't recall any of that. Wait, hey, Korra, what are your first century people who deny Jesus' death by crucifixion? Well, let me make sure we heard that correctly.
And David, even if there were, and I don't think there were, I don't think we have any evidence that there were, but even if there were, I'm more concerned about what the disciples of Jesus were proclaiming.
Yeah. The people who knew him were in the correct area, not some weird people later on influenced by Greek philosophy and so on, who came up with weird theories about the divine and the emanations and stuff like that. And then, he couldn't have died because he didn't have a body. Oh boy, what is this? Let me see what she said.
not passing away, and then when he was taken off and so on and so forth, that reconciles the gospel accounts when people saw him again. So we see a multitude of disputes, not just within theists, but within historical groups in the 1st and 2nd century, and we see church fathers acknowledging this as well. For example, we have Ignatius's congregation. We even have Paul in 1 Corinthians. We have a multitude of different study Bibles that say...
Paul in 1 Corinthians, are you aware of Paul doubting the crucifixion or saying that others doubted the crucifixion there? Resurrection, yeah, but crucifixion?
Right. Resurrection. So in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, you have Paul is addressing them. They're asking him questions that seem to suggest that there are people in Corinth who are saying, hey, there's no afterlife. When you die, that's it. Nothing happens. So you think Jesus rose from the dead, and this guarantees that you're going to be raised from the dead at the general resurrection? No, this life is all there is. And that leads Paul to say later on, look, if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. So, of course, the implication is, but Christ was raised, therefore we will be raised, therefore the Christian life is worth living. So that's who he's addressing. They're not questioning whether Jesus died. This girl, I've never heard of her, Kay, because this is just not my lane, what you're, the interaction with Muslims, but she doesn't know what she's talking about.
Huh. You heard it here, folks, from an actual historian. Korra doesn't know what she's talking about. And so, some of it's just seriously misleading, like saying, oh, but, these same scholars would acknowledge that there were other groups who doubted Jesus' crucifixion and thought that someone else was put in his place. Yeah, weird Gnostic groups who did so based on their weird theological views, not based on history, and they start in the 2nd century. Other things she's saying are just complete nonsense. She says, oh yeah, and there are 1st century sources, and then she says, even the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians says, bull. That's just made up nonsense. And she's kind of becoming famous for like speaking really rapidly and saying a bunch of nonsense so you don't have time to respond to it all. And it's a really, really sad tactic. But
yeah, now she does. I've never seen her or anything. I still haven't seen her, but
you will never see her unless she leaves us.
She does speak rapidly, and we both do public speaking, and it's easy for us to have something in our mind and maybe something different comes out of our mouth. That happens. It's kind of rare, but it does happen. And maybe she doesn't have all her facts down, and she's just, rapid firing stuff, and she says stuff that she's just not being careful. I don't know. I don't know her well enough. Either way, she's wrong, whether she's intentionally trying to deceive or she's just inexperienced or naive. I don't know what it is, but she's wrong for whatever reason.
Yep, I'm pretty sad. And you missed yesterday. We went through a different section. She gave us, for the future, one of the most legendary responses now ever. So give you a quick outline, because this is awesome stuff. So we've been using an argument we call the Islamic dilemma, and that's because
I like that.
Yeah, Muslims say, oh, your gospel's been corrupted, and so we point out what the Quran actually says, that it affirms the inspiration and the preservation and the authority of our scriptures, orders us to judge by our scriptures. Says we have to believe in all of our scriptures, not just parts. And Allah even says he'll send us to hell if we only believe in parts of our scriptures. So we run that argument. And this has actually forced Muslims into some very strange positions, which would be considered heretical by Orthodox Muslims, because one of their main ways to try and escape the Islamic dilemma is they say, Allah is just affirming your scriptures in general, not on not necessarily on every little particular. So if you have some strange thing somewhere, we don't have to believe that. It's just affirming them in general. So one of the responses to this general confirmation, apart from just pointing out, Allah doesn't say that. He says he's confirming all of it. But even if you want to grant general confirmation, we point out, well, even if it's general confirmation, God is our Father in both the Old Testament and New Testament, and it's all over the place, Old Testament and New Testament. So you've got this weird group now, and other Muslims mockingly call them the Fatherites, who, because they understand the Quran is affirming the previous scriptures and that God is called a father all over the Bible, and that the Quran denies that Allah is a father in any sense, not in a literal sense, not in a metaphorical sense. There's no sense in which Allah should be called father. They have to say, okay, well, if he was clearly called father in the scriptures that he affirms, and yet he rejected being called father in the Quran, he must have allowed it then and then abrogated it in the Quran. So he changed his mind. He said, oh, nope, they're taking this too seriously, so I'm gonna rule that out. No more calling me father. Right? Whereas traditional Orthodox Muslims, they said, if you call Allah father in any sense, or say that this was ever allowed in any way, that's kufr, unbelief. It's unbelief. You're a non-believer if you even say that. But now you have an entire community of Muslims who are being called the Fatherites. But anyway, in that debate, which we went through yesterday, Christina, who's God Logic's wife, she said, well, why did so it's not literal, but why did Allah let them call him father? Why would he do that? And she said, oh, because, he's a creator, and so he's like a father. And so Christina said, well, could you call Allah mother then? Could you, because, he would have sort of given birth to everything by creating. Could you call him mother? And she goes, no, because there's no precedent in the Bible for that. And so that came out, and then so we started pulling up passages where God describes me, I'm like a woman in labor and stuff like that. And but here's the thing: since according to her reasoning, you could call Allah father back then because of this. The same reasoning would mean you can call him mother, and you do find the precedent for God comparing himself to a mother. But calling him father was abrogated in the Quran. Referring to him as mother was not, and therefore you can still call him mother because nothing ever changed it. And so she accidentally started what we're going to call like the cult of the Motherites, and she's going to be stuck with this forever because we're all going to start using this, and she gets to take all the credit for coming up with Allah is a mother. So. Yeah, she's causing all kinds of problems with the nonsense she's spouting. And this is an ongoing problem in Dawah. They're so desperate to win any point in the moment. They'll say anything, they'll make anything up, and they have to deal with the consequences later on. And so wild stuff. All right, let's see if she comes up with something better.
that Paul is addressing groups that denied the crucifixion in his time. So we see.
She said it. Okay, there you have it, Mike. She didn't mess up. She said it again. She said 1 Corinthians, and now she says Paul was addressing groups who denied the crucifixion. Let's play it again.
We have Ignatius's congregation. We even have Paul in 1 Corinthians. We have a multitude of different study Bibles that say that Paul is addressing groups that denied the crucifixion in his time. So we see early.
What study Bibles, Korra? Korra, you're on X. Could you send me the study Bibles that say Paul was addressing various groups that denied Jesus' crucifixion? Wait, see, we don't think there are any, Korra, but you can prove us wrong and show us those study Bibles that say that.
Dispute. This isn't a 600-year later development. This is something that was always going on in the first century. But I wanted to ask, because you said that this is a well-established historical event, right?
Right.
Can you give me an example of a source that establishes this without a shadow of a doubt?
Well, did you hear what she just said, guys? Guys, you got to stop that. You got to stop that right when someone says it. Establish this beyond a shadow of a doubt. Is that how history works, Mike?
Not at all. Oh, man. Yeah, not at all. But what historians, look, none of us can get into a time machine and go to the past and verify our conclusions. All historians can do, the practice of history, is to look at the documents, the data, and then you see what are probably facts. Facts would be data that you look at that, so strongly evidence that virtually everyone agrees on, and there's strong evidence for it, okay? Not every historian will agree on what's a fact, all right? So, but if you look at things, I like what Paula Fredrickson, she's not a Christian, she's a historian of Jesus, and she called it historical bedrock, facts past doubting. And she doesn't mean beyond the shadow of any doubt. She's just saying things that are just really, really strongly evidence. She calls it historical bedrock because that's what you want to build your hypothesis on, all right? So you look at the historical bedrock, you look at other historical data, and you formulate hypotheses based on that data and those facts. And then you assess the hypotheses on how well they can account for the data, the relevant facts. And the hypothesis that best accounts for those is regarded as what probably occurred. And so you've got criteria such as, I'm using those used by Behan McCullough. You got explanatory scope. In other words, the hypothesis that can account for the maximal number of those agreed upon facts. So let's say you got 10 facts, all right? A hypothesis that can account for all 10 of them is far more likely to be true than one that can only account for 5 of them. That's just common sense. And then you have explanatory power. Given the truth of a hypothesis, we expect certain things to result. The extent to we get those things, that hypothesis may be said to have explanatory power. So like with, if Jesus died by crucifixion and did not rise from the dead, what we would expect is for the messianic movement that Jesus started to fade off into history and only become a footnote in future histories written. That's what we would expect. But that is not what we get. We get Jesus' disciples that all of a sudden they just get empowered and they go out and, you can kill me, you can torture me, you can throw me in prison. Doesn't matter. I saw him. He's alive. And they despised death. They cared little for death, because they believed that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. That gives great explanatory power to the resurrection hypothesis. You look at plausibility, given our background knowledge, which hypothesis is compatible with our background knowledge. Now, people are going to dispute over what our background knowledge is. Some are going to say, well, God doesn't exist, and so supernatural events don't occur, miracles don't occur, and since they don't occur, then the resurrection wouldn't be compatible with our background knowledge. A theist might look and say, well, God does exist. He does interact in our world. There's evidence that's very hard to dismiss for a number of events that strongly have the strong appearance of being miraculous. And so they would say, yeah, our background knowledge would allow that. Doesn't mean Jesus rose from the dead. Maybe God wouldn't even wanted to raise Jesus from the dead, but at least it would be compatible with our background knowledge. And then you look at ad hocness. Ad hocness is, based on speculation, non-evidenced assumptions and things like that. So the hypothesis that is least ad hoc has wins there. So the hypothesis that can fulfill those criteria of inference to the best explanation better than any other hypothesis, historians would regard that as what's probably true. Probably true. And then historians disagree on how strong the evidence has to be. Most historians would say something like more probable than not, or maybe just a little more than that. I think the burden of proof should be a little bit higher than that, but I'm just telling you where most general historians are. If it's just more probable than not, or a little higher than that, that's where most historians are. They're not looking for beyond the shadow of any doubt. That's just naive and shows she is not at all familiar with the practice of history.
And yeah, so any future debaters now, these ladies may be new, and this happens all the time. It happened to me tons of times. Someone brings up some new position and stuff, and you don't catch it. You don't catch it until afterwards or something like that. But yeah, if someone says that there's no good historical evidence or something like that for the crucifixion, then says, okay, what shows beyond a shadow of a doubt? Again, there are people, even scholars, who doubt Muhammad existed. There was a German Muslim scholar of Islamic studies. He was a convert, Sven Kalisch, in Germany. He converted to Islam, became known, started going by Muhammad Sven Kalisch, and after years of using hyper critical and hyper skeptical methods against the claims of the Bible, Christianity, and so on, he decided eventually, hey, why don't I apply the same methods I'm using to attack the Bible to Islam? And he walked away and said, he left Islam and said, I don't think Muhammad existed.
Yeah.
So Korra, that was a Muslim scholar who concluded he didn't think Muhammad existed. So if you're just going to say, oh, this guy says this guy says this, this guy says this, and then if you're going to say beyond a shadow of a doubt, well, guess what? I mean, I believe Muhammad existed. I've debated to Jay Smith and Robert Spencer, and it's actually hard to debate this because you don't have sources for the first century of Islam. And the ones you do that could be a mention of Muhammad, they don't line up with this. They don't line up with your story. And so it's actually hard to defend because one of the first things you're looking for is early sources, and you ain't got none. And so I believe Muhammad existed. I believe that's the best explanation for the evidence. I wouldn't say that beyond a shadow of a doubt. I wouldn't say that about the existence of your prophet. So, Korra, you just know for future reference where you're setting the bar, that bar will eventually be applied to you, just so you know. That's on you. You did this, Korra.
That's an important point that you're making there, David. A few months ago, I was interviewed on a YouTube channel there was a Christian and his friend who is an atheist, but he seems open to the gospel. And so they had me on, and we were talking about the resurrection of Jesus. This guy seems intelligent, but he's coming back with all these, objections, and I deal with them. And basically, to the best of my recollection, he was just bringing up all these things, but he wanted stronger proof, stronger evidence. And so I just said to him at the end, and he said, is there anything you would say, as a final word? And I said, yeah, if you're an atheist, you have been very critical about the evidence that I've brought forward to you for the resurrection of Jesus. And I think you've been overly critical. And so I would just encourage you to be consistent then and assess your own worldview with the same kind of skepticism, hard skepticism that you've given to the resurrection of Jesus. Because if you do, then you got to deal with things such as, how did the universe come into existence? Why do we have design in the universe? Explain objective morality. Let's talk about consciousness. Where did consciousness come from in the evolutionary process? Even Cullen McGing, an atheist philosopher of mine who's taught at Oxford, has said the problem is insoluble. There's no plausible naturalistic explanation to account for how consciousness came into being through naturalistic, unguided evolutionary processes. And so there's all these things that you have to be able to account for as an atheist. And so can your atheism survive such criticism? He'd never thought about that. So I think it is fair to point out to this young lady that if you're going to apply this, that it's got to be an undisputed fact insofar as not historians saying that Jesus died by crucifixion, but no movement throughout history could doubt Jesus died by crucifixion. And if you're going to say it's got to be proof beyond the shadow of any doubt, apply that to Islam and you'll find that you can't accept that either.
Yeah, and I just gave an example of someone who did exactly that. Here's the standard I'm applying to Christianity. Let me apply that to Islam. Oh, I don't even think this guy existed. He was just consistent. So yeah, Korra, if you took that standard, proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. Name one thing you can prove in Islam beyond a shadow of a doubt. One. Name anything. I'd be interested in hearing it.
Prove anything beyond a shadow of any doubt, right?
Yeah.
Prove that you aren't a brain in a vat somewhere being stimulated by a mad scientist to have the perceptions that you're having. Prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that that is not occurring right now.
Yeah, prove we're not in the Matrix right now. Prove powerful aliens aren't tricking us right now. Hey, Korra, since your God's a cosmic trickster, prove that we're actually watching you debate right now, and that Allah's not tricking us into thinking that we're watching you debate right now. Guess what? He could be doing that, right? So beyond a shadow of a doubt, interesting.
Maybe
Especially
Korra doesn't exist.
Yep, maybe she doesn't exist. Maybe Allah just makes everyone think that she exists to annoy us. All right, let's check this out.
We have the Gospels, which are eyewitness accounts, and we also have Jewish historians, we have Roman historians, we have other extra biblical accounts of this.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with the Gospels, because obviously that's going to be your foundation as Christians. So you say that the Gospels were authored by eyewitnesses. Do you have any evidence for that?
I don't, but what I can ask you is this. If Allah made Jesus to appear that way, why would he allow millions of people to be deceived for 600 years? If he's the most merciful, wouldn't that be kind of cruel for millions of people to be deceived by this?
Beautiful.
So that was interesting. So this Christian here is like pointing out the absurdity of the Muslim position, but Korra, she's not trying to defend the Muslim position. She's just trying to attack the Christian position. And did the Christian woman say that it's not eyewitness testimony or something?
She said she didn't have any evidence. Now, that doesn't mean there is no evidence, because there is evidence. But I think she's saying that she's not aware of any evidence, which is fair enough. This girl, that girl, I don't know her name. She seems like she has some knowledge of some stuff, but none, I don't know how much any of these girls, the Christian girls, have, worked on this kind of stuff beyond Sunday school.
Well, let's see where they go with this. But yeah, Korra's not going to defend, because think if she tried to defend the Muslim view with this method, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Allah tricked people into thinking that Jesus died by crucifixion, and prove that historically. Think about that. We have a bunch of first century sources. She cast doubt on all of them by going to a second century source, which rejected the crucifixion because of theology, not because of history. Then she lies about the Apostle Paul, says Paul's correcting people who didn't believe Jesus died by crucifixion. And then she would go with the Quran 6 centuries later with one verse in the Quran, and we're all just supposed to go with that, and that would be beyond a shadow of a doubt? No, she would never accept that burden of proof. But that's what she's putting on the Christians. So interesting stuff. Let's see.
That kind of deflects from the topic itself, because obviously I can answer that question, that's not a problem, but I'm emphasizing on you saying that there were eyewitness accounts. If you say that the Gospels were eyewitness accounts, how can you simultaneously say that you don't know who wrote them? How can you now verify that they're eyewitness accounts if you can't even prove that the people who you claim wrote them actually wrote them?
Well, we also had Paul who mentioned that there were 500 eyewitness accounts that were still alive today.
Yeah, but that's not 500 eyewitnesses. That is one non-eyewitness mentioning that there were 500 eyewitnesses, not to the crucifixion, but allegedly to the resurrection. So that's completely different, but it's...
She's right. That's eyewitnesses of the resurrection. It is important to note, though, they wouldn't have been witnesses of the resurrection if Jesus hadn't died, right? Like you got to die for there to be a resurrection. But I want everyone to take note, because this is very important, guys. That again, the standard that she's using. You don't have 500 witnesses. You have one guy talking about 500 witnesses. So what you really have is one guy. That's very important. That's very important to grant. Now, you can actually make a case for the 500 because Paul's talking to people like they know what he's talking about, right? It would have been weird to just make that up, and everyone's gonna be like, what 500? No, we never heard of this, right? So he's saying this in an atmosphere where people would know whether you have these witnesses or not. But following that reasoning, because there's a huge problem with consistency in Islam. All you Muslims who think that Abraham, Moses, David, John the Baptist, Jesus all supported Islam, you've got one guy saying that, Muhammad. One guy is saying that everyone agreed with him. So it's not, you don't have this cloud of witnesses to support your view. You got one guy saying everything. And that one guy seems to be making things up like it's a sport.
Like you wanted to get a word out?
She said that Paul, she said there's no eyewitnesses. I don't know if I guess she's referring to the crucifixion. I mean, Paul claims to have been an eyewitness of the resurrected Jesus. And he knows others who, he knows others who were claimed to have been eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus. He met with Peter, James, and John. Peter and John, two of Jesus' three closest disciples, and James, Jesus' half-brother. And they, in Galatians 2, an undisputed letter of Paul, they're certifying that what he's proclaiming is what they're proclaiming in terms of the gospel message, at least. And that gospel message, as he goes on to say in that oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, you've got the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances to individuals and groups, friend and foe alike. So, I mean, you do have some eyewitness testimony. And I would go ahead and I think that Matthew and John are closely rooted in eyewitness testimony. Did Matthew and John read to papyrus? Probably not. I think they probably had some people helping them. At least this is what the Muratorian fragment and Clement of Alexandria say. And it's entirely plausible that you would have, as John and Matthew were coming to the end of their lives, that people would be begging them, don't take this to the grave with you. Well, I can't write well, I'm not educated well enough to be able to write a whole biography of Jesus. We will help you. Certainly there would have been some trained people amongst them. Certainly in the New Testament itself, we find at least 11 names, who would have been wealthy, had the means, and would have been very happy to pay for a secretary to write down as a ghostwriter, let's say for Matthew and for John. Been very happy to do it. So I think we do have eyewitnesses. And Mark is writing, according to Papias, in the early 2nd century. And Papias says that he got his information from associates of Jesus' apostles, those who traveled with Jesus' apostles. And at least 2 of those apostles, he said, were still alive at the time when he received this information. So it's the late 1st century that Papias, who's writing in the early 2nd century, it was the late 1st century when he received this information. And he says that Mark was Peter's translator, and he wrote down what he remembered Peter had said. So there you've got someone very close to the event itself, having an excellent source, and he's talking about how Mark is writing what the eyewitness Peter, Jesus' lead apostle, one of his 3 closest disciples, had been teaching. That's pretty good stuff.
And then you've got Luke, who says he went and interviewed the witnesses
That's right.
about Jesus, and I mean he talks about various things like the he mentions the women who were there, and this is the guy who says he went and interviewed the eyewitnesses and so on. But there are kind of two things here. So she's requiring eyewitness testimony to verify something, which here again casts doubt on anything in Islam, including Surah 4, verse 157. You've got Muhammad saying it. Was Muhammad an eyewitness when he's saying these things? No, he's stealing stuff from Gnostics. That's why they called him the ear. They said he believes whatever anyone tells him. Yeah, but
who was saying that about Muhammad?
That's according to the Quran. They called him the ear. They said,
Interesting.
it's in Ibn Ishaq, which is by the way, Ibn Ishaq, our earliest biographical account of Muhammad. It was written more than a century after his death. And these are the guys who are telling us to prove things beyond a shadow of a doubt. We're dealing with tons of first century sources who are all in total agreement about Jesus' death by crucifixion. She has to go outside the first century to start finding weird philosophers and stuff to start and treat them as historical sources. But guys, these are the gymnastics you have to do to deny something like the crucifixion and to defend the one verse in the Quran from 6 centuries after the event, from a guy that, using Korra's method, she can't even prove existed. And this is what we're supposed to believe. But yeah, just two things there, Mike. So one, we're talking about there's obvious here. There's a lot of crazy things here. So according to Korra's view, were there eyewitnesses of the crucifixion? Yes, because Allah disguised someone. So everyone saw it. According to Islam, everyone saw it. So that's not the part you should be in doubt about. The question is whether Allah actually disguised someone and made him look like Jesus. That there was a crucifixion isn't disputed. That people believed that there was a crucifixion, that people witnessed what they thought was Jesus being crucified is not disputed. That's what she's attacking. And so if there's no evidence of that, then great. We don't even then the Quran is wrong too, because if the Quran were right, then people would have seen it. But if she's saying we have no evidence that anyone saw it, okay, well we have no reason to think that even the Quran's insane account is correct. So so that's one issue. Why is she denying that there were eyewitnesses of the crucifixion when there would be, according to the Quran? It would have just been an amazing illusion by Allah, but people would have seen it. So that's just stupid. So there's that really weird issue. Then there's the issue of whether we have eyewitness testimony, and this kind of all over this was a public event. This was a public event. If people had gone out and started talking about Jesus' death by crucifixion, it was a public event. If it wouldn't have happened, people would be like, "What are you talking about?" Like all through the book of Acts, when they're pointing back and saying, "Hey, you guys know this happened. This was a public event. You all know this happened. This wasn't done in a corner." They don't say, "What are you talking about? We don't know what you're talking about. Jesus, who's this guy? He wasn't crucified. We don't even know what you're talking about." They didn't ever. Why? Because it was a known fact. It was a known fact. So you've got those kinds of issues. But then beyond all that, Mike, to know something historically, do you have to have a first-person account of an eyewitness, or can you know things otherwise?
Yeah, no, of course not. Plutarch is largely regarded as the greatest ancient biographer. He's writing in the early part of the 2nd century, and we have 48 biographies he wrote that have survived. He wrote over 60, but 48 have survived, and most of them involve people who, he doesn't have eyewitness testimony. Now, he is getting some eyewitness testimony from others, but Plutarch is not an eyewitness to most of the events that he's reporting. But we know a lot about the past from Plutarch, even though he wasn't an eyewitness, especially for what he's reporting about Julius Caesar and Cicero, Pompey, Crassus, Antony, things like that. He wasn't an eyewitness to those.
Yeah. So Yeah, these are just questions, guys. When people raise a burden of proof to some level and stuff, call them on that real quick, right? Just it's pretty easy for future reference to call them on that. So, can you show beyond a shadow of a doubt? Just pause. Wait, that's how you know something historically beyond a shadow of a doubt? Is that what you're claiming right now? You should call people on that. And also, if they say things like you need first person eyewitness accounts, or you can't know something historically. You can deal with that in two ways. One, you can argue that we do have eyewitness testimony recorded, and then, but also before you even do that, hey, are you saying the only way you can know anything happened is to have first person eyewitness testimony? Because you don't have first person eyewitness testimony for anything Jesus says in the Quran. Anything, not one statement of Jesus, not one. Show me first person eyewitness testimony for one thing Jesus says in the Quran. You don't have first century sources saying it, second century, third century. You got it in the Quran, and it's definitely not eyewitness. So anyway.
Well, now, David, I just had a thought. Maybe you can correct me on this, okay? Muhammad never saw the Quran. Didn't he get it from Gabriel?
Yeah, supposedly.
So if he got it from Gabriel, Gabriel is the eyewitness of the Quran, not Muhammad. So Muhammad is a secondary source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's if you went in the what they believe the ultimate source is. If a guy comes up and says, "Here's what Jesus said," okay, that's what you're saying. Any eyewitnesses involved here? But yeah, you're pointing out even if you grant what they believe about the Quran, it still wouldn't be. Muhammad's not an eyewitness. Someone's telling him something.
Right.
And,
so if we were to grant what Muslims believe about Muhammad receiving the Quran, Muhammad's relation to the Quran is the same relation as Mark to Jesus. You had the in-between who would be Peter.
Yep. So, yeah, Korra is using a standard she can never in a million years allow to be applied to Islam. And guys, that's a sign of a failed argument. This inconsistency.
Yes, I actually wanted to say, so she said there was 500 eyewitnesses, and you brought up atheists, but there were also agnostics. These people could have believed otherwise. They had no reason to make others believe that Christianity was what it is. And also, she mentioned about 600 years going by that why would God allow, that goes against his nature. God would not allow for people to be deceived, for Jesus Christ to appear to be crucified, because that goes against his nature. God says in Numbers 23:19, God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. You keep mentioning things that God changes his mind, that God is faithful. God's word is upright. God's word is perfect. It's complete. Nothing outside of the Bible is something that it's everything we need is in the Bible. It's inerrant. There's no errors in the Bible. And she mentioned the 500 eyewitnesses. Mary was there as well. There was also a centurion that was there as well, a Roman that walked by and said, that is truly a man of God that's on that cross. There's people that the 500, the texts aren't just religious texts. These are eyewitness accounts. And if you go into a court and you say, oh, this happened, that's a burden of proof if you do not have an eyewitness to attest for that. And we have witnesses.
But the issue is, the way that I'm going about this is I'm saying, if you are claiming that the Bible contains eyewitness testimony, how can you claim that the Bible contains eyewitness testimony if you can't prove that it was written by eyewitnesses? Then I'll ask, where does this testimony come from? To which she responded, she said, okay, we have Paul attesting to 500 eyewitnesses, not to the crucifixion, but rather the resurrection. But that's not 500 testimonies. If I come to you, and let's try and be a little bit consistent, right? If I come to you in the 7th century and I say that I saw the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, split the moon and 500 people were with me, is that one source or is that 501 sources?
Okay, well, let's forget about the eyewitnesses' testimony.
Wait, I want that question answered. Okay. Is that 501 sources or is that one source claim?
This is good to know, Korra, because your source on Muhammad splitting the moon, your earliest source is over a century after the time of Muhammad. Oopsie. Huh. Not a first century eyewitness account. This is bad. This is just terrible.
Mean that there are 500 sources.
Okay, so to speak to your point, these people that said, the eyewitnesses that stated that Jesus Christ testified that Jesus Christ was in fact crucified on the cross, people could have refuted that at that given time. People did not refute that. They actually acknowledged that and said it did in fact
Yeah, but
happen.
my question's not being answered, though. Would that be one?
Because you've got a stupid standard, Korra. I mean, they're pointing out like the people. So this sister pointed out two things. One, if your theory is resting on God being a cosmic deceiver or just letting people deceive, I mean, keep in mind, the Muslim view is God deceived people. But she's just pointing out if God just let everyone be deceived about this for centuries, you have a pretty low view of God. So that's one. And yeah, then the other, she's saying the Christians are going out and announcing this stuff. You're not going to be announcing Jesus died on the cross for sins if no one knows what you're talking about. And everyone's going, what? What are you talking about? Jesus never died. We don't even know who you're. This is weird. I don't even know. I don't think
she does
think
give
we
a
need to watch all
point.
this.
You know, it's not 501. It is one.
She's right about
that.
that.
Doesn't mean those 500 don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the more than 500 doesn't. And Paul was an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus, not the actual event, but to the risen Jesus himself. He claims to be an eyewitness. If John is involved, which I think he was, in the composition of John's gospel, if Matthew was, well, there you got some eyewitness testimony.
And the 1 Corinthians Creed, I mean, that's the early creed put out by the early Christians, and it lists all these eyewitnesses of the resurrection. She's focusing on the crucifixion. No one would have concluded resurrection if Jesus hadn't died. So the point
This is the gospel message that he says in Galatians 2. He ran past the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, and John, and they certified that his gospel message was on message with what they were proclaiming. And he says, death, burial, resurrection, appearances to who? To Peter, to the 12, to more than 500, to James, to all of the apostles, and then he adds his own name to the list. So he meets with Peter 3 years after his conversion, and he also sees James, the brother of Jesus. 14 years later, he meets with Peter, James, and John, and runs the gospel message past them to ensure he's preaching what they're preaching. And then when he articulates the gospel message that he preached and by which they were saved, believed and were saved, the appearances to Peter and James. So of course he's getting this from these apostles. This is eyewitness testimony from them.
There's something we haven't brought up here. I'll just briefly mention it. Could go into a lot more detail here, but you also have something like this. So this is Mark 9. Jesus again foretells death, resurrection. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. And he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered. And this is Jesus, guys. He says, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. We actually have a ton of this in
testimony.
We have a ton of this in the Gospels, right? Where Jesus, in various ways and at various times, on multiple occasions, is telling his disciples that he's going to go up to Jerusalem, that he's going to die by crucifixion. And you got it right there in Mark, but you got Matthew. Matthew is one of his disciples, and so
you got it several times in Mark, right?
Yep.
Several times in Mark. So you have it first. It appears in Mark 8:31 through 33, where Jesus predicts he's going to die and rise from the dead, and Peter pulls him aside, and the Greek says he rebuked Jesus and says, no, it won't be this way. And Jesus turns and rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan. So you apply the criterion of embarrassment to that. Why would you make up such a story and cast your leader, the guy that was going to take over once Jesus died, why would you do this and intentionally cast him in such a negative light as to call him Satan? And then one chapter later, chapter 9, which is the verses that you just looked at, verses 30 through 32, you have Jesus saying, the Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men. And there is a play on words there. You have it's staircasing. The Son of Man will be delivered into the hands. The Son of Man will be handed over into the hands of men. So you got man, men, handed, hands. And so this is a deliberate thing. It's there to help people remember what Jesus said, and it's clearest in Aramaic, which would have been Jesus's primary language. So that would seem to suggest that it goes back even earlier. So it's early. It's embarrassing. You have Jesus predicting at the Last Supper that they're going to drink, it's like remind as they drink the wine and eat the bread. It's to represent of his body that's been broken for them, the blood that he has shed for them. So he's predicting his death there as well. That's just in Mark. Then in Matthew and in Luke, you have the sign of Jonah, right? So, and then in John, you've got Jesus saying in John chapter 2 about destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it. And his disciples after his resurrection understood that he was talking about the temple of his body. So not only is it early and embarrassing, it's rooted in eyewitness testimony because you're getting it there closely affiliated with Peter and John and Matthew. And you have multiple independent sources there. You have a motif that is prevalent amongst all four biographies of Jesus. This is some of the strongest type of historical evidence one can ask for. So yes, it seems very clear that Jesus did predict his imminent death and resurrection. Now, here's an argument that I came up with 20 years ago that I called the Islamic catch-22 argument. Jesus predicted his imminent death. Okay, I just gave several reasons for thinking that he did, without assuming that the Bible is divinely inspired, without even assuming that it's even generally reliable. I just took and applied the simple criteria of authenticity, several criteria, common sense criteria that historians would use. Even general historians use these criteria. And you can conclude that Jesus predicted his imminent death. Now, either Jesus died in imminent death as he predicted, or he did not. If he did not, well, that would make him a false prophet. And that would expose the Quran as mistaken, because the Quran claims to be the exact words of God. On the other hand, if he did die, as he predicted, an imminent death, then the Quran is mistaken, because as you pointed out in Surah 4, it says that he didn't. God only made it appear that way. In either sense, the Quran is mistaken.
Yeah, and if you toss in the Islamic dilemma there, in other words, if Muslims want to doubt that Jesus said these things in the Gospels, well, Allah orders us to judge by the Gospel, and so why would he be telling us to judge by a corrupt book? But yeah, this is just insane. So you have Jesus all over the Gospels predicting that he's going up to Jerusalem, where he's going to die. This is all over the place. It's straightforward claims by him, and it's in parables, and it's the reason for instituting communion, and so it's all over the place there. You have multiple independent sources. You mentioned that. Got multiple independent sources. You have our earliest actual source material in the New Testament. It's the 1 Corinthians Creed, which tons of scholars date to within 2 years of the crucifixion, and it proclaims Jesus' death for sins and his burial and his resurrection. And then you have sources outside the New Testament. You have obvious eyewitness testimony contained in the Gospels and the book of Acts. It's like if you set the bar so high that nope, this isn't a good historical case. Again, Korra, you can't. show me anything in Islam that can stand up to that level of scrutiny. You don't even have a source within the first century of Islam. You got nothing. So if you're going to be skeptical about this and the best known fact about Jesus from all these sources, great. Don't ever, ever, ever tell us you know anything about your fake prophet.
Hey, let me throw in something that's pretty cool. So last year, I got to meet and become friends with a New Testament scholar named Tom Schmidt, and he's a pretty cool guy. And he came out, I think it was just last year, with an academic monograph published by Oxford University Press on the Testimonium Flavianum. That's the famous passage in Antiquities, Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Section 63, where he mentions Jesus, that he performed astonishing deeds, that he gained followers from the Jews and the Gentiles, that Pilate at the instigation of the leading men among them, the Jewish leadership, that is, that Pilate crucified him, and that his disciples reported that he appeared alive to them later. Now, over the years, Josephus scholars and New Testament scholars as well, have debated on how much of the TF, Testimonium Flavianum, how much of the TF is authentic, and whether it's authentic at all. Now, back in the year 2000, 2001, I communicated with Louis Feldman, a Jewish scholar. He's since deceased, but he was the foremost Josephus scholar in the world at that point. And I said, hey, of all the Josephus scholars, how many of them, what percentage of them do you think would say that the TF, that Josephus did not write any of it? And he said, maybe at most 1 out of 3, maybe it could be 1 out of 5. He says, most people by far think that Josephus mentions Jesus there. It's what he does, said about it. And he said, I like what John Paul Meyer said. So John Paul Meyer gave a toned down form of that. So he didn't think that he mentioned resurrection, but he thought that he did mention the death of Jesus, and Feldman did as well. Well, here's the thing. Tom Schmidt argued in this monograph, and it's received some pretty good reviews so far. He argued in this monograph that TF that has come to us is essentially what Josephus wrote. He just said the tone that Josephus is using throughout, it's neutral. It's not positive. It's not negative. It's neutral. But here's what I think is pretty cool. It's Josephus's sources, who he had contact with. Now, he gives evidence that Josephus
he knew James' family, right? Like James?
Nope. But
Wait,
you have an idea.
I remember hearing about this several years ago, and how they're connected to where they knew like people who would know, but I forget now who.
Yeah, this just came out last year. So he personally knew Ananus II. Ananus II was the high priest.
Yeah, no, I've heard this. Yeah,
who put James, the brother of Jesus, to death, and as a result, he was deposed from his high priest office. Okay, so Josephus personally knew Ananus II. Now it gets even better. Guess who Ananus II? Guess who his father was? Ananus I, or also called Annas. Mm-hmm. He was the former high priest that after Jesus was arrested, they brought Jesus to Annas's house to be interrogated, according to the Gospel of John. And according to Mosaic law and the priesthood customs, the priest, Jewish priest, had on Passover, they had to be together as a family in their own house to celebrate Passover, which means that Ananus II would have been there. No, he would have been a teenager. He would have been a teenager in the house the night that Jesus, after being arrested, was brought to that house, and Ananus' II father, interrogated Jesus. But there's more. Guess who Ananus II, guess who his brother-in-law was? Caiaphas, the high priest who put Jesus to death, who turned him over, condemned Jesus, and then turned him over to Pilate and told him he needed to put him to death. So Josephus, look how close he was to the very people, the three most arch enemies of Jesus and his disciples. That is who Josephus knew or was one step away from them. That is an extraordinary finding that Schmidt made, that it's like, wow. So when he reports the death of Jesus, think of who his source were. He's got his friend Ananus II, who hated Jesus and the Christians and put his brother James to death. It's amazing. And this same Josephus reports the death of Jesus as well as the death of James, his brother.
But Korra says no. Yeah, I don't think we want to get through too much more of this, Mike. This is frustratingly dumb, especially when there's stuff out there that people could research, like what you're talking about. And we're getting proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. Oh, my goodness. Well, let's see if she comes up with anything interesting right now. Other than that, we'll probably wrap it up.
Allegedly, or would that be 500 testimonies from Paul specifically? Because Paul, when he claims 500 eyewitnesses, he is the only person who makes this claim. And to that fact, we don't have all of these individuals' names, right? So I'm asking, would that be 500 sources or one source?
So I'll just chime in. Well, something that I find interesting is you can say like 500 or one sees the 500, see Jesus, whatever, raised from the dead. The fact is like there is eyewitness accounts, but here's even like the bigger thing is like it's not just in the Bible, and it's not just with these scholars that we find like when we just Google, who saw Jesus, who wrote about Jesus. There is still documentation coming out today about people, archaeologists finding Old Testament like journals and stuff written on stone tablets claiming that they saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. There was one discovery just a few years ago, actually, that, and you can look this up afterward, like people are still discovering real people, like eyewitness accounts on tablets, on stone, on whatever it is when they do digging on archaeological sites in the Middle East. And so, again, you can look that up afterward. And
I'm not sure what she's talking about here.
It certainly doesn't, I can't think of how that relates to Jesus' crucifixion.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
Yeah, but I think that that's just so true because that's such an outside point of view, right? You can say 100, 500, etc.
I do want to touch on that because I did want to mention data outside of the Bible as well, but I wanted to emphasize on the Bible first, just because that's something that will unite the four of you guys. You all accept the Bible, right?
Should unite you too, Korra, because your God affirms it.
So I wanted to touch on that first, but it seems like there's really not much of a response in terms of whether or not it's one source or 500 sources. But even if, like, let's say it's one source in this instance, it's Paul saying that 500 people attested to this.
You still interested in this? They're kind of going down a rabbit trail.
No, I know one other. I asked for the link to this last night. There is one other thing I'd want to point out where she makes an egregious error. She says the first manuscript we have of either the New Testament or something that mentions the death of Jesus is post-10th century, which would make it post-Islam. And so therefore, it's not credible. Not only is that false, it's not even close to being true. So I did a little bit, I have a book that was put out by Charles Hill and Michael Kruger on the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament. And then I looked at some others as well. You've got the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, both of which contain the entire New Testament, all the Gospels, all the writings of Paul, all the everything in our New Testament, and even more are in those two manuscripts. They are dated to the middle of the 4th century. In fact, Codex Vaticanus may be even a little bit before that, a little bit earlier. So you've got those. Then you have Codex Alexandrinus. That has virtually all of the New Testament, and it has absolutely has all of the the passion and resurrection narratives in the Gospels, and has a lot of the stuff that it's missing. It's missing just like 3 parts or something like that, and none of it really would negate it. It still has all the claims that Jesus died by crucifixion and rose from the dead, and that is in the 5th century. You've got in Paul's writings, you've got 2 manuscripts that date to around the year 200, and those manuscripts do contain him saying that Christ died, or that he was crucified, or that he rose from the dead. In fact, the creed, the oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15 verses, I think that one contains just verses 3 through 6 in it, still has his death, burial, resurrection, and a number of the appearances. That's in there. It's dated to the year 200. And I could name many more that are dated to the 3rd and 4th century. So, I mean, and that's relatively recent for the ancient literature. When you look at things like the Roman literature, I've got a book on my shelf. It's a $400 book. The title is Text and Transmission. I think a guy named Edwards is the editor for it. And it lists all the ancient Latin writings. There's 99 of them, less authors, but between them, there are 99 writings. And he says in the introduction that for all of those, the number of manuscripts that they use to create a critical Latin text for all of these, there are only about 1,700 manuscripts. And most of them, by far, most of them date between the 9th and 16th centuries. I mean, you know, you're talking about writings that are from the 1st century BC, maybe even a little bit earlier, to maybe the 4th or 5th century. And the earliest are, well, you've got a few fragments, but other than that, most of them date between the 9th and 16th centuries. Well, I'll just give you one example. The writing of Tacitus's Annals of Rome. And he's considered probably to be the greatest Roman historian. Yeah, we've got a number of manuscripts, but they can all be traced back to 2 manuscripts. And one is dated to the year, I think it's 850, and another one, I think it's 1050, something like that. 2 manuscripts. And he's writing in the early 2nd century. And the earliest manuscript we have is the 7th century. I'm sorry, the 9th century. And that's for our greatest Roman historian. So it's not unusual to have late manuscripts. But like I said, just for the death and resurrection of Jesus, we've got a bunch of them that date to the year 200 and to the 3rd and 4th century and 5th century.
And you've got Tanya here saying, what if you coordinate a debate between Dr. Licona and Korra on the resurrection of Jesus and you moderate? Yeah, that would be funny, but there's no substance there. It would be someone speaking really fast and spouting complete idiotic nonsense. And then, yeah, the only way it works is like just like we were doing here. It's like, it's even, I mean, you have to pause after every half sentence she says to correct all the blunders and so on. So historically, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Methodologically, it's just a disaster. Factually, getting things all wrong, but saying things really fast. And this is, oh man. Yeah, sorry, Mike, this got old real quick.
That's all right. I like to stay in my own lane. Just stay to my kind of research and stuff. And yeah, I like to debate atheists and agnostics. They just come with, I think, some better arguments. They're not so much concerned about rhetoric as they are substance. And I found over the years, it just seems that Muslims are more concerned about rhetoric than they are substance.
Yeah, no question there. But yeah, like even someone like Shabir is going to be light years ahead of her in terms of actually knowing what he's talking about, even if he's wrong and he's trying to get at a similar conclusion. Yeah, you would never see Shabir like just spouting complete nonsense like this over and over again. Or
no.
Be on a shadow of a doubt. Be on a shadow of a doubt. Oh, boy, this is bad. Take these last super chats. And first correction, it's from yesterday. You said yesterday that the average Muslim isn't familiar with the Yajuj story. This story is actually well known, so my claim still stands. You said well known. I said the average Muslim doesn't know it. That something can be well known by people and your average Muslim doesn't know it. And I'm saying this because if you talk to an average Muslim, they know Surat al-Fatiha and a couple of other passages. And other than that, they have absolutely no clue what I'm talking about. Here's my jizya. Goodness gracious. His mother was there at the cross, John 19:25. Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, it's all over the place. It was a public event. It was a public event according to the Quran itself, even though the Quran is claiming that it was a mere illusion cast by the Arabian version of Loki. Why do they want to deny it? That's just how desperate they are. That's funny. That's Ida. Per Korra's ruled that history is naturalistic and oh yeah, I did recall that. She was saying, nope, historians, you can't, there can't be anything supernatural. Oh yeah, it was because of the prophecy. Someone brought up the Isaiah 53 prophecy, and she said, no, that would be something miraculous, and historians wouldn't grant that. You've done a lot of work. You've done a lot of work in this, Mike. What are your thoughts on that sort of thing?
Well, today I would say the majority of practicing historians, philosophers of history, even biblical scholars would say that historians are not within the rights to investigate miracle claims, and because they can only look at natural things, they don't have the tools to detect God. So you have like Bart Ehrman, he'll say it in a couple of different ways. He'll say if the resurrection happened to be a miracle by its very definition is the least probable explanation. Historians can only look at the most probable, therefore they can never affirm that a miracle hypothesis occurred. And that's one way he'd put it. I would say to that, well, when you say a miracle is the least probable explanation, answer me least probable in reference to what? Because if you're saying least probable by natural causes, I would agree that an event that of coming back to life by natural causes, if that's what you want to call a miracle, that is the least probable explanation. After being executed, come back to life by natural causes. But I wouldn't call that a miracle. If you're saying a miracle is the least probable explanation, and I'm saying least probable in reference to what? Because if God existed and wants to raise Jesus, then it becomes the most probable explanation. So either way, I think that you haven't thought through enough what you mean by least probable explanation. Now, if you want to take...
And all that Ehrman seemed to be like influenced by Hume, which was just...
That's right.
I mean, I actually like Hume. I disagree with a lot of things he said, like in his dialogues concerning natural religion, but I mean... I love Hume and his argumentation and writing style, but on that issue it was just a disaster. I mean, he had to for his argument to work, he had to assume a universal human testimony against miracles. In other words, he assumed that no miracle has ever occurred, and then pointed out that if someone comes to you and says something miraculous happened, well, since there is unanimous human experience against miracles, it would be the least probable. You're assuming from the beginning that no one has ever witnessed a miracle in your
Right.
argument against a miracle. And it's funny because Craig Keener, you know him, he actually did he pointed out in his book on miracles the Pew Research study where they looked at one Christian denomination in 10 countries and asked how many people believe that they have witnessed a miracle in their lives, and they were over 200 million. One denomination in 10 countries, 200 million people believe they have witnessed a miracle. And if you thought, okay, what about all denominations in all countries? You're probably going to be over 1 billion. And Hume just takes for granted no one's ever witnessed a miracle. Okay, well that's just
What if
terrible and
99% of them are wrong?
Yeah.
You still have a lot.
Yeah. So, anyways, yeah, that's super sloppy, and but it did become popular, and it's just normal part of a philosophy class to read that. And if you don't actually look at what the actual evidence is, it seems like a good argument, but people absorbed it and they didn't realize how stupid it was.
Well, let me throw out one other thing. I think that we can embrace. I have some sympathy for a portion of that argument. I do think that historians may be outside, or probably outside of their profession, to identify God as the cause of something, because we as historians, we don't have the tools to be able to detect God. I mean, we could affirm something and say, personally, we think God is the cause. That makes sense. But we don't have the tools as historians to affirm it. So let me give an analogy I'm fond of. Let's say that astronomers have identified a comet that's on a collision course with the moon. And through mathematical calculations, they arrive at the conclusion that it's going to crash into the moon on a certain day and time. And when that moment arrives, they've got space telescopes zoomed in on the lunar surface, and boom, they see it happen. And as the lunar dust settles, they notice a message written on the moon's surface. And it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, a good astronomer, a responsible scientist would say, wow, that's an extraordinary event. I don't have any plausible naturalistic explanation to account for how it happened. It would seem to suggest God's behind it, but as a scientist, I don't have the tools to be able to detect God as the cause. So I'm just going to have to be satisfied with affirming the occurrence of the event and leaving the cause undetermined. Now, a bad scientist would say, wow, that's an extraordinary event. I have no plausible naturalistic explanations for it. It would seem to suggest that God did it, but as a scientist, I don't have the tools to affirm or detect God as the cause. So I can't even say that the event occurred, despite all the evidence I have before me that it did. Now, we'd say that's crazy, but that's exactly what those historians and biblical scholars who are refusing to look at miracle claims historically are doing. I think what we can do when it comes to, say, the resurrection of Jesus is we can look at the evidence and say, wow, it looks like something extraordinary happened. He was dead and then he was alive. That's the best historical explanation. Jesus predicted he would rise from the dead. It looks like he did. They interpreted it as resurrection. Of course, I don't have the tools of a historian to be able to detect God or make theological statements about this, to affirm the theology behind it, but I can affirm that he rose from the dead. I just can't go any further with it. Mm-hmm. I think that's completely legitimate to do something like that. I can still be a methodological naturalism. I'm performing historical method, doing history, and I can affirm the occurrence of the event while leaving the cause of the event undetermined. And those historians who don't like that, look, just because you can't stomach the implications of the conclusion doesn't mean you just say, well, you can't even arrive at that conclusion. Mm-hmm. Now you're weighing in with your worldview, not the evidence. And bad philosophy corrupts good history.
Yeah, it does, and that's kind of all over the. You can even see how Hume influenced scientists. There's a Richard Dawkins clip with him and Peter Boghossian, where Boghossian said, what would convince you that that God exists? Like, what could happen? And Dawkins said, if you'd asked me years ago, I would have said some big booming voice saying, Richard Dawkins, believe in me. But I've since come to realize that if I heard that, I would just assume it's a hallucination, so it wouldn't work. And so he said that, but then they kept rolling with it. And he got to the point where he said, even if God wrote a message in the stars, believe in me, Richard Dawkins, he would still just sooner attribute it to aliens than to God. There's powerful aliens writing things out in the stars. And so he's kind of doing what any naturalistic explanation would be better than a miraculous explanation. But what's weird here is like this right here, now that I look at it a little more, so this comes up when someone points out Isaiah 53. She goes, but historians would reject that because they can't believe in prophecy and so on. Well, historians could say that there was the prophecy, they would all grant that there is. You have the prophecy made and seems to line up pretty well. And then as a Muslim, you should take the prophecy seriously since your God affirms our scriptures and so on. And then you see it happening. But what was interesting right there is she's sitting there ruling, oh, no, historians would reject miraculous accounts. Okay, well, the biblical accounts, Jesus dies by crucifixion. The resurrection's miraculous, but the crucifixion is just a Roman crucifixion. If you want to go to the 2nd century and go with Basilides, okay, now he has Jesus miraculously disguising someone else and then miraculously disguising himself. And so guess what? They wouldn't take that seriously, right, Korra? And that's what the document. Oh, and they definitely would never take Surah 4, verse 157 seriously, right? Right, Korra? Like not even potentially. In other words, given the methodology that you say is standard among historians, no historian could ever accept that account, right? And never should. And so I don't know. I don't know what to do, Mike. I don't know what to do. It's just, Dawa's dumb, and it destroys your brain. And it's almost like the Dawa people, that's like, they're just trying to wear you down with stupid nonsense to the point where you just, I'm so sick of this, I'm leaving, so that you walk away and it's too stupid. It's too stupid to deal with. And then they go, you see, everyone's running from our powerful Dawa. Bad stuff, man.
I'm really glad that you're doing what you're doing, David.
Yeah, I'll keep up with it. But it is cool.
We need people like you.
No, it is cool because back in the day, there was only a few people doing it, and now there's a ton. So these are actually good times. I keep telling all the young people they need to be happy because it sucked 20 years ago doing this stuff. Hey, Dawood, you should react to Destroyer of Sunnis, Malik, and the 7 Qurans. Oh, that's interesting. I will screenshot this because that sounds interesting. Yeah, Mike, Malik that's the guy who doxed a bunch of us earlier this year, and Korra is his protege, so she's super, super good person. Is Licona being a Bayesian right now? Come on,
no.
Dan. Come on, Dan.
I'm not a Bayesian.
We're all a little Bayesian.
Yeah, I think, it's like Bayes' theorem has pretty much 3 elements to it. And I think that historical investigation can count 2 of them. The problem is you or involve 2 of them. The problem is 1/3 of Bayesian, assessment is the prior probability. How do you assess the prior probability of something like Jesus's resurrection? I was talking to Greg Cavan. We were debating about this years ago. He's a philosopher, and he wanted to use Bayes' theorem to be able to reject the resurrection. And I said, well, 1/3 of that calculation is the prior probability. And you just don't really do that in historical investigation. It's kind of like, what's the prior probability of the U.S. dropping nukes on Japan in World War II? Now we got the posterior probability. We can look at the evidence and say, well, the probability is 1. It's 100% that we did it. We got good evidence. What's the prior probability? All right. That's like when you look at based on the background knowledge, what's the prior probability that you're going to win the lottery big? Well, it's about 1 in half a billion, right? Somewhere around that. So what's the prior probability of the U.S. dropping nukes on Japan in World War II? How do you assess that? How do you assess in science, what's the prior probability of strings?
Do you want the answer or not?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because it sounds like you just want to ask 700,000 questions about the prior probability.
Yeah, well, he acknowledged later on, we had lunch together. He said, I don't know how to answer that. The thing is, how do you assess that when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus? You have to know that God exists and wanted to raise Jesus.
Well, as far as Bayesians are concerned, and there are different Bayesians and so on, but generally a Bayesian is going to say that your prior probabilities are kind of your own business, based on your background knowledge, and as long as they're not violating any rules of probability, like you can't have you can't have probabilities adding up to more than one or something like that, or and you shouldn't make something zero unless it's just absolutely impossible. But in general, your prior probabilities are kind of your business. They're way more concerned with how you update your probabilities as new evidence comes in. So it would kind of be a separate issue. You would basically be discussing with someone about whether their prior probabilities that they assign are reasonable. Like how are you assigning that low a probability for that? Does that actually make sense? But yeah, the Bayesians are actually like it's the mathematics. It's okay. If you're starting with this and you do the math, then do you update your confidence level correctly as new evidence comes in? So that's kind of the Bayesian, that's kind of the Bayesian part of it. You would kind of argue on the reasonableness of the prior probabilities separately, because that's not the Bayesian part of it.
But ultimately, then if you're leaving up the prior to the individual, then it's subjective. That was a problem that
your prior probability can be subjective. The updating of it, that's mathematics. So if you just assign some prior probability to something happening and says 0.0000000, and you just said it's a million zeros and then a one, as long as you were to update it. Keep in mind, that's not the Bayesian part of it. That's you assigning a really low prior probability to something. The Bayesian part of it would be, okay, now that you have that, what does the math show about how some bit of evidence would affect your confidence in that? In other words, you could say, hey, this new evidence shifts it just a little tiny bit, as long as you update it appropriately or something like that. Then, and by the way, I mean, given how much certain evidence would be expected given the truth of a hypothesis, but not on other hypotheses, you can actually overwhelm really, 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 really low prior probability. Someone can say that's very, very, very slim. Okay, but this new evidence, this new evidence here, only makes sense in light of this hypothesis and has an extremely low probability on any other hypothesis, and therefore, bam, it shifts it.
Well, you could have someone who, claims to have won lottery big. The prior probability is one chance in whatever, 500 million, something like that. But all of a sudden let's say you knew this person, and they show you their bank account, their investment portfolio, and it's quite impressive. And you knew that just last year they lived in a mobile home, now they lived in a mansion. They were driving a beater, now they got a Bentley. That's just some pretty good evidence that overcomes astronomical odds against it in the prior probability.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So yes, if you said, "Hey, this person, my friend, bought one lottery ticket. What are the odds that he won?" You say like 1 in 17.1 million. You know the exact probability. Okay. Well, now I have all this evidence, and if that evidence only makes sense on the hypothesis that he actually won the lottery and doesn't, you could still have alternative hypotheses. He's maliciously lying and he stole this money and he's just lying about it and so on. But if you think that's a really low probability based on what you know about your friend and so on, then the evidence it can shift it. It can shift it. So, cool stuff. So stop hating on Bayesians, man.
I don't hate on it. I just think, well, let's put it this way. Almost all historians eschew putting numerical kind of probabilities to this kind of stuff. And that's what Bayesian analysis does. They do the thing that historians aren't fond of doing. But I mean, I can understand wanting to do assign some kind of a numerical percentage to it. It's 90% probable that Jesus rose from the dead. That's kind of neat. But historians typically, it's kind of hard, and it is, you got to acknowledge, it's kind of subjective to be able to put a number to it.
Yeah, but you can modify it. You can modify it for comparison, where you don't have to assign any numerical probability. You just have to say you can use it to compare two hypotheses. So suppose you were comparing theism and naturalism, right? So you could have like a Bayesian argument from evil. I did my doctoral dissertation on this. So you can say the probability of the kinds and varieties and extent of evil we have in this world is the probability of all this evil is much greater on the hypothesis of naturalism than it is on the hypothesis of theism. Therefore, the evidence massively favors naturalism over theism. Or you can make a theistic argument. You could say if you're comparing two hypotheses, theism and naturalism, and you talk about design or something like that, design and nature, fine-tuning of the cosmos, you say that evidence is much more probable on the assumption that theism is true than on the assumption that naturalism is true, and therefore the evidence massively favors theism over naturalism. So you have ways like that don't require actual inserting specific numbers. Yeah,
I would refer to that as explanatory power. What you're describing there.
Yeah, but it's called the odds form. It's called the odds form of Bayes' theorem. But you can actually you can actually calculate odds and stuff like that, but without even using certain numbers. But no, you can do cool stuff. You can do cool stuff with Bayes' theorem. So don't be a Bayes' theorem hater, man. We have Aussie Abe here saying, this is the most behaved I've ever seen D. Wood. No zoot jokes, just straight commentary. Is this what happens when there is no Turk on the screen? Guys, is an actual historian who interacts in scholarly circles at scholarly conferences and reading all papers, doing all the nerd stuff. And if I'm sitting here, but what about Muhammad and the Zoot? Then it's gonna destroy his reputation. People will be like, look, he hangs out with this rabble here. How can we take him seriously? How can someone as respected as Dr. Licona associate with this psychopath? Someone even said it. That was funny. Then we have is not.
Let me tell you about David being a psychopath. When we met David years ago, and when we all lived in Virginia Beach and our kids were growing up, my wife and I said several times that we trusted David so much that we would not even hesitate to leave him in the house alone with our kids. And that's how much we trusted him. Now, of course, we hated our kids, but no, we would have trusted him enough with our kids. So we love David and Maria.
You're ruining my reputation as a psychopath, man. I want people to be terrified of me at all times. Last two here. This is not on topic, but I have important info for you. The Serbian Orthodox Church has an unofficial price list for their services. It's all over their media sites. Google this stuff. I got to worry about those guys, man. And then last one. That story is well known by Muslims. They don't know anything about anything, Nordine. They don't know. So quit being obsessed. All right, Mike, final thoughts on Dawa responses. Has Korra shaken your confidence in the historical evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion? And as Dawa spreads, do you think, Bart Ehrman and all these other guys are going to be like, wow, I never thought of that. Maybe we need to rethink our claims about the indisputability of Jesus' death by crucifixion?
No, I don't have any concerns that informed people will fall for this garbage. But I do fear that people who are just unknown, they don't know about this stuff. They just haven't spent any time with it. And that's most people, at least here in the United States, that they'll hear this and they'll be gullible because they don't know any better. Because they spend their time on social media all the time and they're not reading. They're not, people used to really get into this kind of stuff more. They were, in the past, they were more educated on a number of things, critical thinking and things like this. People don't think critically anymore, for the most part, the average layperson. So I fear that this kind of stuff, this false propaganda, will mislead a lot of people. So I'm really thankful for the ministries like that you have and Michael Jones, and I've become familiar with God Logic recently, and your friend, the guy who used to be Apostate Prophet.
He still goes by Apostate Prophet.
Okay, so all those and all of those you guys who are involved in this and exposing the falsehoods of Islam, I'm very grateful to the Lord for your ministries. So keep up the good work, brother.
Yeah, that was actually an important point, guys. It's what Korra's doing right here is not going to persuade any informed, intelligent person who knows anything about history. But guess what? Most people aren't in that category. You have tons of people who don't know about history. You have tons of stupid people in the world. You have tons of gullible people in the world. And so those are the people that Dawa targets. And so Mike's pointing out, guess what? That means we need people going around and dealing with that and informing people to keep them from falling for this stuff. And so guys, got to learn to respond to this stuff and keep doing it. Got the last two right here. David Wood is the kind of guy who would give Mike Winger a hug. Yeah, a bear hug until he passes out and I throw him off a bridge. And then what's the prior probability of D Wood being on time? You can actually calculate a prior probability in this. Like if you're going to judge.
That's true. You could.
Yeah. If you're going to judge whether I'm going to be on time tomorrow, then you could go back through a bunch of my live streams, calculate how many times I'm on time. There have been a few, but rare, and you come up with an actual probability. So yeah, it works. All right, everyone. Thanks, Mike, for joining us. Yeah, guys. Sometimes we go all the way through them. Sometimes it's just too. It's going to take 6 hours if you can't go one sentence without stopping because she said something false or dumb. But yeah, maybe better luck next time. But this is Dawa, guys. This is Dawa. All right, I'll be live with Hatun at 8 o'clock. So 37 minutes. Catch you all over on Hatun's channel.